At 86 years old, Ray Stevens has nothing left to prove. Grammy Awards, chart-topping hits, and a fan base that spans generations. But in a recent interview, he cracked open a part of his story he's kept locked away for decades. For the first time ever, Ray Stevens is talking about the Grand Ole Opry, not with praise, but with pain. Most assumed he was always welcome there. But Ray reveals that behind the curtain, something went wrong, something personal, a betrayal he never forgot. Why was one of Nashville's most iconic entertainers never made a member? Why did an invitation suddenly vanish after a mysterious vote in the 80s? And what dark secrets did Ray witness backstage that made him go quiet for over 40 years? The answers are shocking, and they're finally coming out. Before the country comedy legend was born, Ray Stevens was just Harold Ray Ragsdale, a piano-playing prodigy growing up in small-town Georgia. He wasn't chasing laughs back then. He was chasing chords, studying classical music, and mastering the kind of musicianship that Nashville only rarely sees. By the time he was in his teens, Ray could write, arrange, and produce with the best of them. And when he moved to Nashville in the late 1950s, he didn't come in through the front door. He slipped in through the studio walls. Ray quickly found work as a session player and arranger, backing up country stars and crafting hits in the shadows. He signed with Mercury Records and started releasing his own songs. Serious songs at first, ballads, gospel. Then, in 1961, something strange happened. A novelty single called Jeremiah Peabody's polyunsaturated, quick-dissolving, fast-acting, pleasant-tasting, green and purple pills climbed the charts. Ray's musical genius had collided with comedy, and the world couldn't get enough. What followed was a career like no other. Hits like Ahab the Arab, Guitar Zen, and The Streak made Ray Stevens a household name, not just in country, but in pop, comedy, and even television. His song, Everything is Beautiful, won a Grammy and touched millions. He wasn't just the funny guy, he was the one-man band behind it all. Writing, arranging, producing, performing. He blended country twang with pop polish, southern humor with global appeal. But even as his records sold millions and his TV specials became family staples, something odd lingered in the background. Nashville's elite never fully embraced him. Ray Stevens was popular, but not pure. His blend of comedy and music didn't fit the industry's definition of a true country artist. And when it came time for Opry invitations, honors, and tributes, Ray was often left off the list. Still, he smiled. He kept the shows coming, and for years, he let the cold shoulders roll off him like water off a duck's back. But inside, he knew exactly what was happening. And one day, he promised himself he'd finally speak on it. For decades, fans assumed Ray Stevens was part of the Grand Ole Opry family. How could he not be? He had the hits, the history, the Nashville roots, and the universal appeal. He'd performed at the Opry House. He'd stood beside legends on stage. He'd even been invited to introduce artists and appear in Opry-related TV specials. But there was one glaring omission. Ray Stevens was never made a member. Not once. Not even after 60 years in the business. The truth? The Grand Ole Opry never let him in. Not officially. Not permanently. And the reason, according to Ray, wasn't talent. It was perception. In the eyes of the Opry's inner circle, Ray was a novelty act, a comedian, a man who didn't take the genre seriously enough. Never mind the Grammys, never mind the million-selling albums. To them, he was the guy who sang The Streak and Ahab the Arab, not the man who orchestrated entire albums and produced deeply heartfelt songs like Everything is Beautiful. In closed-door meetings, his name came up for induction multiple times, but each time, according to a source close to the Opry board, someone shot it down. Ray was never told why. He'd get friendly nods, vague compliments, and the occasional rumor that "your turn's coming soon," but it never did, and eventually, the silence became the answer. The most painful moment came in the early 1980s. Ray was unofficially told to hold a date on his calendar. An Opry member induction was allegedly in the works. He was excited, nervous, grateful, but that call never came. Days turned to weeks, then months, then years. No explanation, no apology, just a vanishing invitation, followed by a cold wall of silence. For a man who had devoted his life to entertaining millions, it felt like a betrayal, not because he needed the recognition, but because the Opry had become the heart of country tradition, and it had chosen to ignore him. He kept smiling, kept performing, but behind that grin was a wound that never fully closed. Now, at 86, he's finally calling it what it was: exclusion, intentional, personal, and in his words, one of the greatest professional heartbreaks of my life. In his recent interview, Ray Stevens didn't just talk about being excluded from the Opry, he hinted at something far more disturbing: what he saw while working alongside its inner circle. For decades, Ray was close enough to the machine to see it operate up close. He played the same stages, worked with the same promoters, and attended the same backstage gatherings as the Opry elite. And according to him, what went on behind the scenes didn't always match the wholesome image painted for the public. He described a culture of quiet politics, where careers could be made or broken, based on whispered conversations behind dressing room doors. He spoke of certain artists being favored, regardless of talent, while others were pushed aside for daring to speak up. And then there were the secrets, the ones nobody dared put in writing. Ray alluded to seeing stars escorted out of venues to avoid press, label executives passing around favors disguised as business deals, and even one moment in the 1970s that he refuses to fully detail, saying only, "If I had gone public with what I saw back then, I'd have been finished." He didn't name names, he didn't need to. The weight of his words said enough. When the interviewer pressed him for more, Ray simply looked down and said, "The Opry is built on tradition, but some of that tradition was built on silence." He made it clear that many of the people involved are no longer alive, but their decisions shaped careers for decades. They decided who became legends, who got forgotten, and who, like Ray, was kept in limbo. Not denied outright, but never embraced. Fans who watched the interview were stunned, not just by the claims, but by the pain in his voice. For a man known for his light-hearted songs and comic genius, this side of Ray Stevens was raw, weathered, and completely serious. It wasn't just professional disappointment, it was personal disillusionment. He had spent years brushing shoulders with the very people who shut him out, and now, for the first time, he was letting the world see the cost of playing nice in a system that never played fair. In 1983, Ray Stevens received a phone call that should have changed everything. A close associate within the country music world told him to keep a specific weekend open. He was being considered for official Grand Ole Opry membership. No promises, but "It's looking good," they said. It was the moment Ray had quietly waited for his entire career. He cleared his calendar. He told close friends. He even had a new suit pressed, just in case the big night arrived. But as the days passed, the phone never rang again. No letter, no follow-up, no explanation. Weeks later, through a friend who worked closely with Opry staff, Ray learned the truth. The vote had happened, and he'd missed induction by a single person. One anonymous no had shattered what would have been one of the most deserved memberships in Opry history. No one told him who blocked it. No one apologized. The trail went cold. The door quietly closed, and Ray was left standing on the outside, dressed for an invitation that never came. Years later, he was shown an internal memo passed around between Opry insiders during that time. It praised Ray's commercial success, but criticized his non-traditional brand, calling his comedy too offbeat for the Opry stage. The memo suggested that his inclusion could damage the seriousness and tone of the institution. Ray was stunned. "They had me in a box," he said. "They liked my money, liked the crowds I brought in, but they never liked me enough to make me family." From that moment on, Ray never asked about the Opry again. He kept playing shows, producing hits, building his empire, but the silence stuck with him like a shadow. He had done everything right, helped grow the genre, kept his work clean, made people laugh, and lifted spirits in every corner of the country. Yet he was treated like an outsider, in the one place that claimed to celebrate all of country music's voices. Now, decades later, he says it plainly. "I wasn't forgotten. I was dismissed." And the memory of that empty weekend in 1983 still hangs in the back of his mind like a ghost that never quite leaves. After decades of being overlooked, Ray Stevens decided he would no longer wait for the Grand Ole Opry's approval. In 2018, he took matters into his own hands, brick by brick, and built his own legacy in physical form. He called it Cabaret, a state-of-the-art 700-seat dinner theater tucked away in West Nashville. But this wasn't just a venue. It was his answer to every door the Opry refused to open. Cabaret is pure Ray Stevens, classy, quirky, intimate, and meticulously crafted. The red velvet seats, grand piano center stage, gold-accented bars, and walls lined with memorabilia from his career. It all screams of a man who knew his worth and decided to put it on full display. Every detail was personally selected. Every note that echoes in that theater is his. From the lights to the sound system, it's the venue the Opry never let him have. And now, it belongs to him entirely. When it opened, some in the industry brushed it off as a vanity project, but fans showed up in droves. They came not just for the hits, but for the feeling. An evening where laughter, nostalgia, and true musicianship took center stage. Cabaret wasn't built to compete with the Opry. It was built as an alternative to it, a safe haven for those who never quite fit the mold. It became a place where Ray could perform on his own terms, without politics, without pandering, and without being boxed in. For Ray, Cabaret was more than a theater. It was vindication, proof that the audience he built didn't need industry validation. They were real, they were loyal, and they followed him, not the system. Cabaret also allowed Ray to honor artists who had been overlooked just like him. He regularly brought on guests, told backstage stories, and gave flowers to the forgotten. In doing so, Ray didn't just reclaim his voice, he gave others one too. While the Opry clung to its gatekeeping, Ray built a stage where the gate was wide open, and in that choice, he turned his greatest professional heartbreak into something that will outlive all of them. A legacy forged not by invitation, but by intention. For decades, Ray Stevens stayed silent, not because he lacked the words, but because he understood the weight they carried. In Nashville, speaking out against the Grand Ole Opry was like cursing in church. It just wasn't done. No matter how frustrated or hurt he felt, Ray kept his grievances behind a smile. In interviews, he'd deflect. "The Opry's a fine institution," he'd say. "They've got their way of doing things." He knew the rules. He played along, and every time a reporter asked why he wasn't a member, he'd shrug and let the silence fill in the blanks. But those closest to him knew the truth. They saw how the rejection gnawed at him, not out of vanity, but out of principle. Ray wasn't angry that he wasn't famous enough. He was angry that the institution he helped elevate didn't see him as one of their own. He had toured endlessly, sold millions of records, and brought joy to generations, but it was never enough for the gatekeepers. So why now? Why break the silence at 86? According to Ray, it was time. "You reach a point in your life where you stop worrying about rocking the boat," he said. "I've got nothing to lose, and a whole lot to say." He spoke with clarity, not bitterness, with reflection, not rage. He wasn't trying to burn bridges. He was simply done pretending they were ever built. Part of the shift came from watching the country music landscape evolve. As younger artists started speaking out against industry injustice, Ray began to feel less alone. He realized that the Opry's silent rejections weren't just about him. They were part of a larger pattern. And if he didn't tell his story now, it might be buried with him. In recent months, Ray's health has slowed him. He's canceled a few appearances, reduced his workload, and taken more time to reflect. And in that stillness, he found the courage to tell the truth, not to get sympathy, not to pick a fight, but to leave behind the part of his legacy that had remained unspoken. Because after a lifetime of making people laugh, Ray Stevens finally wanted to say something serious, and he knew it would echo louder now than ever before. When Ray Stevens finally opened up about his exclusion from the Grand Ole Opry, the reaction was swift and deeply divided. Fans were heartbroken, angry, and confused. Social media lit up with outrage. Comment sections filled with messages like, "How could they leave him out?" and "Ray is country music." Hashtags like "Let Ray in" and "Hach Opry aus Ray" began trending among younger country fans and classic country loyalists alike. The response was emotional, passionate, and loud. But from the Opry, silence. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement. The official Opry account continued business as usual, posting about weekend lineups and member anniversaries while pretending the storm wasn't brewing. But behind the scenes, sources say there was tension. Some staffers reportedly pushed for a statement. Others insisted Ray's comments be ignored entirely. The Opry had faced controversies before, but never from someone this beloved, this respected, and this overdue for recognition. Among Nashville insiders, the conversation shifted quickly. Off the record, radio hosts admitted they were shocked he wasn't already a member. A few veteran artists voiced quiet support, including one Hall of Famer who told a journalist, "Ray deserves the stage as much as anyone." Even some Opry members, those who had shared stages with Stevens for decades, began to speak carefully, knowing that the public was watching. But not everyone was supportive. A small but vocal group within the traditionalist community dismissed Ray's comments. They labeled them disrespectful and accused him of trying to stir controversy late in life. One unnamed Opry rep was quoted as saying, "Ray always did things his own way. That doesn't mean we owe him anything." The quote only fueled the fire. Meanwhile, Cabaret saw a surge in ticket sales. Fans flocked to the venue in a show of solidarity. Messages of support poured into Ray's website and fan pages. Artists began covering his songs on TikTok, calling him a pioneer, an innovator, and a legend who got overlooked for far too long. The line had been drawn. The Opry could stay silent, but the fans? They weren't done talking, and now the pressure was no longer just on Ray to prove himself. It was on the Opry to explain why they ever thought he had to. In the final act of his remarkable life and career, Ray Stevens has made peace, not with the Grand Ole Opry, but with the truth. At 86, he no longer waits for validation from the stage that shut him out. He's found something stronger: clarity. For years, the Opry was the one honor he quietly hoped for, the one phone call that never came. But now, after decades of silence and a single moment of brutal honesty, he's taken back the narrative and rewritten it on his own terms. Legacy isn't about plaques or membership cards, it's about impact. And Ray Stevens' impact is undeniable. From Grammy-winning ballads like Everything is Beautiful to comedy classics like The Streak and Mississippi Squirrel Revival, he redefined what country music could be. He broke genre walls, made people laugh and cry in the same verse, and introduced millions to the joy of storytelling through song. He wasn't just part of the soundtrack of America, he helped write it. And now, the very stage that refused to embrace him must live in the shadow of what he built without them. Cabaret stands tall as a monument to his spirit. His catalog continues to stream in the millions. Young artists cite him as a pioneer, and fans, both old and new, see him for what he's always been: a fearless, joyful, wildly original voice that the industry couldn't define, and ultimately couldn't contain. In recent interviews, Ray has smiled more. He's lighter. "I said what I needed to say," he told one outlet. "Now I can rest easy." He doesn't want revenge. He doesn't want a last-minute apology. What he wanted was to tell the truth, and he did, loudly, clearly, and with all the grace of a man who spent his life making the world laugh, even when it hurt. If the Opry never calls, it won't matter, because Ray Stevens didn't need their microphone. He had his own, and now his voice echoes louder than ever. Not just as a singer, not just as a comedian, but as a man who finally stood up, told the truth, and let the world see the real song behind the smile. As Ray Stevens quietly closes the curtain on a lifetime of music, laughter, and resilience, one final truth remains. He didn't need the Grand Ole Opry to validate his worth. He was the show all along. At 86, He's not chasing stages or plaques. He's watching the sunset from his cabaret balcony, hearing fans still sing his songs, and finally feeling the freedom of saying what should have been said decades ago. His voice, once tucked behind humor, now rings out with something far stronger: truth. The Opry may have kept its doors shut, but Ray opened his own, and millions walked through them. What he built will outlast the snubs, the silence, and the politics. Because legends aren't made by institutions. They're made by legacy. And Ray Stevens' legacy? It doesn't need an invitation. It is the punchline that hit back, the melody that never faded, the man who made the world laugh, only to leave it thinking long after the music stopped.